Hi there, this is Andrew Cohn. Welcome back to the Inspiring Leadership Book Club. This week, a very interesting new book, 2022 release by Professor Ayelet Fishbach called Get It Done, Surprising Lessons from the Science of Motivation. This is what the book title looks like. I always like to show that to you in case there may be different issues or editions or releases, etc. Fascinating book. And my intention here is to share some of the key lessons from the book, not necessarily everything that's in the entire book, but to provide you with an overview and importantly, some research outcomes, some of them surprising, and also very importantly, some questions to ask yourself about motivation, what motivates you, and how you can use the science of motivation to adjust your plans, adjust your goals, adjust the means toward achieving those goals, as well as to support others to do the same. The book is divided into 4 sections: choose your goals, keep pulling, competing goals, and social support. According to Professor Fishbach, these are the 4 essential ingredients in successful behavior change, and the book is therefore broken into those categories. Each one of these parts has somewhere between 3 and 5 chapters. There's a total of 14 chapters in the book, and then a load of research references in the back of the book. So why don't we begin with part 1, makes sense, choosing your goals. These are the 4 headings under that in that section, and these are the 4 chapters there. The first is called Goals Aren't Chores. Put a number on it. Incentives matter and why you should have more fun. And finally, intrinsic motivation. So with respect to number 1, goals aren't chores, what Professor Fishbach talks about is that a goal doesn't just point you in a specific direction, it also pulls you in that direction. And in order to pull you, it has to feel more like an aspiration and less like a chore. It should not feel like a chore. Be clear that goals are distinct from means. A means is just a way to get somewhere. A powerful goal defines that desirable state, not just how you'll get there. It's got to be broader than just the means. So she suggests that you choose to define a goal in terms of benefits rather than costs. So in other words, set the goal as finding the job rather than as applying for a job, because applying for a job would just be the means to get there. If the goal is owning a house, great, rather than the goal is to save for a down payment. Down payment would be the means to the goal. She also suggests setting abstract goals as opposed to things that are too specific. Yes, if they're too abstract, they're not actionable. But if they're not abstract enough, she says, for example, reading job postings is a concrete description of actions, but exploring career opportunities is an abstract description that explains why you're reading those postings. So the why, the reason, the desirable state, that's what makes it abstract and what makes it juicy and aspirational. She says good abstract goals allow you to contrast your current state with where you want to be, so you can connect the dots and thereby make a good action plan. Some of these things are a bit intuitive, but the way she explains them, I think, is quite clear and useful. She talks about the importance of setting do versus do not goals. She says if you frame something as do not, it's going to feel like a chore, like a suppression in a way. And she says you don't want to set up an anti-goal. Don't smoke, don't gain weight, don't do something like that, but rather what is it that you could be drawn to, not drawn away from. Very important. She says how you set your goals will determine their power. And she says in order to set goals that aren't chores, she suggests you ask yourself a few questions. And with each of these segments, in each of these chapters, I'm going to share with you the questions that she posed in the book at the end of each chapter. So with respect to this section, have you set your goals, and are they the right goals for you? Do they fit the person you are? And are they the best fit? Are they the best for the person you hope to become? Are they aspirational for you? Can you make your goals feel more exciting by focusing on what you're trying to achieve rather than simply on the means to get you there? Are your goals, optimally abstract so that you don't lose sight of where you're going as well as how you'll get there? And can you define your goals in terms of approaching a state of physical and mental comfort as opposed to avoiding an undesirable state of discomfort? And she makes the distinction in the chapter here between an approach goal and an anti-goal. So setting goals this way helps you choose your goals and define them very clearly. Speaking of defining goals clearly, in the next chapter, she talks about the importance of putting a number on it. So she says, as a rule, goals, like recipes, work best if you list exact quantities. For example, walk 10,000 steps a day is better than walk a lot. So if you have a target, it pulls you towards a goal and makes it easier to manage your progress, makes it easier to track. Later on, we'll be talking about tracking progress. When setting deadlines and other targets, you have a better chance of motivating yourself to do your best when there are relatively minor consequences for failing to meet targets. You don't want to set up things that you're going to get slammed if you don't reach a particular target on the way to achieving a goal. And she also talks about, in terms of numbers and targets, it's very important to own the target by setting it ourselves. Set the target ourselves. So she says, even when consulting an expert, whether that's a boss, a personal trainer, a doctor, somebody like that, ask for a set of options to choose from, and then we choose, and that allows us to own the selected targets. She cautions us to be aware of malicious goal targets, or things that might promote unethical behavior or maybe too narrow. And if they're too narrow, they make us forget about the important aspect of the goal we're pursuing. Also beware of goal targets with short-term horizons that could lead us to neglect our long-term interests. So for example, she says we might set a goal of making a certain amount of money every day, and therefore set up our schedule to work 6 hours a day thinking we'll make this much money in 6 hours. And so the goal of the means to making money, to set that goal of making a certain amount of money is to work a certain amount of hours. But what happens if we're driving for Uber, for example, and just as we're coming off of our shift, the rates go up and the premium rates go up at Uber, and we can make a lot more money if we stick around for 2 more hours and work for 2 more hours. We want to be careful. This is an illustration of, we want to be careful of goal targets with short-term horizons that might cause us to neglect our long-term interests. So look a little bit farther out, and there may be ways we can achieve our goals a little bit more easily, a little bit more readily. So don't be too focused narrowly in terms of ways to achieve these goals. She said, once you set up a target, don't get discouraged if you fail to meet it. Recognizing that the goal target is somewhat arbitrary can be really healthy in establishing the goal. So for example, this isn't talking about ignore it, it doesn't matter if you achieve something, but she says, yeah, you can miss a train by 1 minute and it's just as bad as missing it by an hour. But missing your annual savings goal by a few dollars, or your exercise goal by a few workouts or a few minutes per workout, or missing your reading challenge by 1 book doesn't really make a big difference in your life. So don't let those small discrepancies discourage you from sticking with your goal. So in other words, don't be rigid with these things. If it's the type of goal, I mean, yes, if it's about missing a train, it doesn't matter whether it's a minute or an hour and you fail to achieve that target. In terms of some of these things like savings or the like, it's okay to miss it slightly. It's a little bit like the balancing theme that we're going to talk about in a little bit. When do we need to be firm and consistent in reaching goals, and when is balancing appropriate? But at least near the beginning of the book here, she's encouraging us to be a little bit gentle with ourselves and not come down too hard if we miss a goal target slightly. So in terms of putting a number on it and setting targets, she asks us the following questions. Can we put a number, such as how much or how soon, on our goals? Are these goal targets challenging? They should be. Easy to measure? They should be. And actionable? Absolutely should be. Have we set these targets ourselves, or did someone else set them? There's a typo in there. Set them for us. Again, very important for us to set our own goals. We have more motivation that way. We're more lit up to do that, even if it was suggested by someone else or someone else suggested the menu. It's for us to choose what we want. And finally, the fourth point here, do these targets work for us? Is it something that's realistic and challenging? And is it a goal target that's real and solid for what we really want? So kind of a global question there, very important question. So put a number on it, be specific in terms of choosing goals. The third dimension of choosing goals that she identifies is what she calls incentives matter and why you should have more fun. So she talks about the importance of rewarding your efforts, and that helps you stay motivated to stick to your goals in the short run. So, getting fancy coffees and things like that can be tangible and immediate. Incentives work. She talks about rewarding the right thing. Be sure we are rewarding the right thing, because if we reward the wrong thing, we'll get the wrong action. So we want to be sure that if it's an incentive, and the way we can check this is to see what are we doing in order to satisfy that incentive, in order to reach that incentive. Are we potentially cutting corners or something like that? That's important. Be aware of too many incentives. And this is a very interesting, one of the dimensions of research that I thought was a little bit surprising here, but interesting. Too many incentives can undermine early incentives or successful incentives. And she talks about the dilution principle, which says that the more goals that a single activity serves, the more weakly we associate the activity with our central goal. So for example, if we hear that eating carrots is good for lowering our blood pressure, we might assume that it's less beneficial for our vision. So in other words, if I know that carrots are good for my vision, as my mom always told me, and I learn that carrots are good for lowering blood pressure, just by virtue of adding another benefit to that means, and the dilution principle says that we might think, well, maybe it's not so good for our vision. Not quite rational, but it's a way our minds work of diluting the benefit of something for this when we realize it could also be beneficial for this. If you learn that a bottle of wine is more affordable, you might assume that it's less delicious. That's the author's personal example. I think it's very interesting. So if we introduce another benefit for something we're doing, it could somehow dilute the association we have between that activity and the goal that we're trying to achieve. She talks about how uncertain incentives are more motivating because they're harder to get. We shouldn't know that we're going to get it. It should be an uncertain incentive. For example, in getting a job, we don't know if we're going to get it, so it makes us work a little bit harder, she says. And at the end of this chapter, she talks about questions that will help us set up our own incentive system. What incentives can we add to our goals so that we have extra reasons to follow through? For example, how can we consider rewarding ourselves with a movie night or a bubble bath or a treat after we get a flu shot or finishing an important project? What incentives can we add? Question 2, consider the incentives that exist for pursuing our goals. Do these incentives modify the meaning of pursuing the goal? For example, if there's an external reward that we set up for reading books, it could reward the enjoyment we get from reading the book. So revise an incentive that modifies the meaning of pursuing the goal. We don't want to be reading the books just for that little chit, just for that little incentive. If it changes the way it feels, if it changes the meaning for us of pursuing that goal, change that incentive. Point 3, have you added incentives to new activities that you're still exploring? Again, this is this notion of dilution here. If you're still figuring out what you prefer, incentives could lead you to believe that you're only doing something for the incentive it provides. So be careful that we don't catch ourselves doing things just for the incentives, as opposed to doing things for the fulfillment of reaching the goal. Too many incentives can sometimes dilute things and interfere with and help us lose connection to the goal and why we're doing it in the first place. And finally, do the incentives fit the activity? So for example, financial rewards are a poor fit for pursuing relationship goals. If we said that we'll pay you to call up your grandmother it's not something, not an incentive that's going to fit the activity and the reason you're doing the activity. We should remove mismatched incentives, as she calls it. So incentives matter. And finally, the fourth part of choosing your goals is this conversation about intrinsic motivation, which means essentially pursuing an activity that feels like an end in itself. When we are intrinsically motivated, we do something for the sake of doing it. We do it for the sake of doing it. She said to determine the degree to which any given activity is intrinsically motivating, you could ask, to what extent does pursuing that activity feel like achieving a goal itself rather than simply a step towards achieving the goal? We're more intrinsically motivated. We recognize we're more intrinsically motivated when doing a step towards the goal is fulfilling in itself. It doesn't just feel like, oh, I'm doing this because it will get me something. It feels like I'm already getting something from taking that step, She says, the shorter the time between doing the activity and reaching the goal, the more intrinsically motivating it will feel. So if it's something that's way out there, it can feel less intrinsically motivating. That's what the research shows. She said there's 3 ways to make a boring or difficult activity more intrinsically motivating. First, make it fun. Second, find a fun path to getting there. For example, finding workouts that are fun. If exercise or some health dimension is our goal. And third, notice the fun that already exists. So if it has something to do with diet, for example, we might focus on what we like about eating foods that are healthy. So it's a way of reframing and making things more intrinsically motivating if they may not feel that way. So that last one about notice the fun that already exists. How can we see it a little bit differently? And this is a great example too about, this is an internal hack. How can I shift my own thinking to make something more fun and therefore more intrinsically motivating? She said it's important to put ourselves in others' shoes and ask ourselves what priorities we would have if we were them. And that's because she says we have a bias that we see ourselves as having stronger motivation and more pressing goals than other people. She talks about that in the research. It's almost as if we think, well, because we're so drawn to these goals, other people don't have the same level of motivation that we do. It's not a superiority dismissive thing, but she calls it the better than median effect. We have to recognize that other people want to be intrinsically motivated as well. And they are intrinsically motivated, perhaps to the same level as us. And by the way, our future selves are also going to be as intrinsically motivated by certain things as we are. We talk about that at the end of this chapter with the questions. You'll see she brings that back. So to increase our chances of following through on a goal and leveraging that intrinsic motivation, how can we make pursuing a goal more immediately rewarding? So for example, could we introduce music or audiobooks to an exercise routine and therefore make it more immediately rewarding and enjoyable? What's the most fun path to pursuing our goals? For example, could we join a water aerobics class rather than buying a treadmill, exercising at home alone, which may not be quite as inviting or engaging for us? Are there immediate benefits we can focus on while pursuing the goal? So for example, could we redirect our attention, that's that internal hack again, could we redirect our attention to certain parts of the workout, things that we like? For example, that euphoria we feel with certain routines, a certain pump, a certain sense of accomplishment, a certain game we might play with ourselves by working out or with others. And by the way, later in the book, she talks a segment about sharing goals with others and the benefits of that. And the fourth question here, how can we remind ourselves that other people, including our future self, are just as intrinsically motivated as our present self is? Reminding ourselves that will help us set achievable goals for ourselves and others and improve our relationships as well. So that's section 1 about choosing goals. Some good suggestions in there, some clarity, some research that supports it. Section 2, keep pulling. These are the 4 sections in keep pulling. Progress increases motivation, the glass half full and half empty, which she calls the middle problem, and you're wrong, learning from negative feedback. So in terms of progress increasing motivation, she talks about something called the goal gradient effect. The more progress we've made, the more eager we will be to keep going. We are fueled by progress. We are fueled by positive results. So it's very important to carefully choose how we measure progress. She said, for example, she says, progress increases impact. Each action that we feel moves us closer to the finish line, feels like it has a bigger impact than the action we took before. It's as if we have all this steam building up behind us, and that's helpful. She talks about a very interesting experiment that was done at a New York cafe. Half of the customers got a card with 10 open slots. So buy 10 coffees, get one free. So 10 open slots on the card. Another group of people received a card with 12 open slots, but 2 of them were stamped already by the time they were given to the customers. Same card, same, you need 10 to get the free cup of coffee. The people who thought they received a head start by getting those 2 stamps on their cards came back to the cafe more often, and they filled their reward cards more quickly. Because they felt closer to the reward, they were more motivated to reach the finish line. It's very interesting in terms of setting up incentives for ourselves or for people around us. How do we help people feel like they have a head start? I think that's very interesting. She says humans have a tendency to keep working on things simply because we've already invested in it. This is the sunk cost fallacy. We should keep going because we've already done this much work so far. Yes, that could be a problem, but it's also something that can be leveraged. Mere engagement increases motivation. Mere engagement increases motivation. And she says, in terms of how we feel on the journey, do we feel excited, relieved, happy, proud, etc.? It's important to know that our feelings are evoked by the difference between the actual rate of progress and the expected rate of progress. So are we progressing as much as we feel we should be? It's not an absolute sense of progress, what's a good amount of progress, but what are our expectations? That's going to determine how we feel about it. She says when we feel bad, it's because we expected we'd be farther along by now, right? So in that way, our feelings inform our motivational system. At times, feeling good about our progress increases our motivation. At other times, feeling bad about our lack of progress increases our motivation. Now, wait a minute, so which one is that? What do we want to pay attention to? That's the next chapter. So hold on in your questioning there. So in terms of questions we can ask, in terms of spotting progress to increase motivation, here are the questions. Look back at what you've accomplished. Does that mental exercise help you regain your goal commitment? So this is an invitation for us to do that. Look back. Does that help us regain our commitment? Does it fuel that goal gradient effect? Does it help us retain our goal commitment? Does it remind us why we've chosen to pursue the goal in the first place? Look back. What have we accomplished? Also, look ahead. What do we still need to do to accomplish our goals? Does that make us eager to start moving? Pay attention to our feelings in terms of looking back and looking forward. And finally, here, turn into our emotions. How do we feel about the goals themselves? If we feel good about holding our goal, but not as good about the progress we've made, look at our feelings, trust our feelings as a guide to our actions and help us sustain our motivation. This is a more open thing. It's a good coaching question for others and for ourselves. How do we feel about our goals? So question 1 and 2 is about how do we feel about our progress or lack thereof. Question 3 is how do we feel about our goals? Pay attention to our feelings. Okay, as I mentioned, the next chapter is very interesting in terms of continuing to pull and make progress. And that chapter is called The Glass Half Full and Half Empty. So she talks about monitoring progress and how critical that is for sustaining motivation. She said, well, some people say that you should look at the glass half full, meaning what have I done already? What progress have I made already? Other people say that we should focus on what hasn't been done so far, the glass half empty. And that'll be more motivating for us. So which is correct? And she says they're both right. It depends on the person and the circumstances. So on the one hand, commitment promotes consistency. So when we feel committed to our goals, each action we take towards the goal heightens our commitments and reinforces similar actions. So it's all about consistency as a demonstration of commitment. But there's another school of thought that progress promotes balancing. So balancing meaning I'm going to really forge on these goals. I have to get to that exact thing. I have to make that train, etc. That's the consistency. Whereas other times it's a balance. Some days I have to do it. Some days maybe I don't have to do it. So progress promotes balancing says that the motivation for pursuing a goal can stem from a lack of progress. In other words, if I'm falling behind a little bit, that'll motivate me to move forward. But if I've looked behind me and see that I've made a good amount of progress, maybe I can loosen the reins and balance things a little bit. And it's interesting that it depends on what the goal is, as well as our own personalities, which we'll talk about here, and how expert we are, which we'll talk about in a moment. But it also depends on what the goal is. For example, like Alcoholics Anonymous is all about consistency. There's no like, oh, I'm going to balance and just, fall off the wagon this weekend. No, consistency is critical. Whereas other things like diets can be about balance. You can choose to use your calories any way you may want to. You can treat yourself to a dessert that's going to be way off the diet. And that's okay because you've done really well this week. So it's balance or consistency. And she talks about the research for both of these. I think it's interesting. She says, monitoring how far we've come, for example, monitoring how far we've come moving through a long line makes us feel more committed to staying in that line. So it talks about research. I'm talking about a queue in a shop. When I talk about a line. She says, looking back increases your belief that whatever you're waiting for is valuable and worth the wait. So you'll stay motivated. She talks about an experiment that was done at a lunch shop, a restaurant in Chicago. When customers saw that there were more people standing behind them, I noticed that, in other words, I'm moving along in the queue, I see there's more people behind me. Then research shows that people who saw more people behind them expected their sandwich to taste better than when they were in the back of the line. So the experience of looking back and saying, oh, where I'm making progress, I have been waiting, I have invested this time, makes me anticipate, look forward to, and expect a more enjoyable outcome, just as a result of seeing that progress. I think it's very interesting. She says, so now the question becomes then, well, which is going to be more motivating for us in a particular circumstance, looking back or looking forward? And she says, when you've just started something and you want to figure out if you're good at it, your completed actions increase your commitments and your missing actions decrease your commitments, right? So if you haven't done something that you said you would, it decreases your commitments. But if you have, then it fuels you and it makes you move forward, right? If you're just getting started. So she says, therefore, novices are more motivated by the glass half full because we're still figuring out if we're good at it or not. So that progress is going to have that kind of impact on us. Whereas experts and people who are working on something they know is very important to them, they don't question their commitment. They know they already care to a high degree. And therefore, they're better able to sustain their motivation if they focus on what they didn't do. So she says, for example, if you talk about going to the gym, if you're new, then you're going to feel a lot of motivation and encouragement all the times that you've been going to the gym. This is my 4th time a week. I feel terrific, right? But if we're very comfortable and the gym's like a second home to us, then every time we skip a day, for example, it's going to kick us and we're going to be motivated to go to the gym more. So she says, to effectively manage your progress, you should flexibly and strategically switch between looking back and looking ahead. And in order to do that, ask yourself the following questions. She says, for a given goal, are you balancing your efforts, working hard when you're falling behind, or consistent in your efforts, highlighting the goal by consistently striving towards it and not falling behind at all? So this is a way to do a self-assessment. Are we balancing or consistent with respect to that goal? Question 2, how confident are you about your goal commitment? When you're uncertain about the commitment, you can sustain it by looking at the glass half full. What have I already achieved? When I'm fully committed to the goal, however, then I want to look at the glass half empty. That will keep me going. And finally, how much experience do we have with the goal? As she says, if you're a novice, watching the glass as if it's filling up is helpful. If you're an expert, check the glass as it starts to empty. I think this is very interesting research. Where do we want to look at what we've done before? Or do we want to look at what we still have to do? Chances are, if we're a novice, we want to look backwards for that encouragement. If we're an expert, we want to look ahead for that little bit of a push. Even if it means that we're not going to be driving consistent, we could be balancing, but we're going to be motivated by looking forward if we're expert. The glass half full and half empty. The next section relating to keep pulling has to do with what she calls the middle problem. And this is a very interesting section of the book and very practical as well. She says, during the middle, not the start or the finish, our enthusiasm and motivation are hardest to maintain. She said, beginnings and endings are special. Middles are ordinary. So long middles are dangerous. She says that people loosen their ethical standards in the middle more than they do at the beginning and the end. Research has shown that. So to use this tendency to your advantage, if this is human nature essentially, then how can we leverage this? She says, make the middles short. So for example, a weekly healthy eating goal is better than a monthly healthy eating goal because the middle of that weekly goal is going to be shorter than the middle of the monthly goal. Set a shorter goal, reduce the middle. She said another strategy is to use temporal landmarks to celebrate a new beginning, right? So if you think, okay, it's a new beginning this week, it's a new beginning this month, and maybe a new beginning today. I wake up in the morning with an intention to, or a goal to eat more healthy or something, like increase my knowledge on something, for example. If we can think of the present moment as a beginning rather than as the middle, it will help keep us motivated. Very interesting, I think. So questions to ask ourselves in order to minimize this middle problem. How does being in the middle affect our motivation to get something done or to get it done right? I think the dogs seem to be very animated by this particular question. So for any given goal, which is more important to us? To get it done or to get it done right? To pay attention to that, that's important. Can we pay attention to the actions in the middle and make them more memorable so that they will matter? Actions in the middle don't seem to matter as much. We can slack off. What could we do to help them matter more? Can we set monthly, weekly, or even shorter sub-goals, like as discussed? This is what can we do to shorten the middle? You can minimize the tendency to cut corners in the middle by minimizing the middle itself. In question 4, can we identify arbitrary or legitimate or something, but even arbitrary temporal landmarks to make a fresh start? Monday, the first of the month, birthdays can all mark new beginnings towards important goals. So the middle problem, very, very interesting thing that we can, there's hacks for that. And that's what she's talking about in order to overcome a human tendency to lose motivation in the middle and lose focus in the middle. The next section I believe the last section in part 2, Keep Pulling, has to do with feedback and what she calls you're wrong, learning from negative feedback. So here are the questions for learning from negative feedback, this section. Actually, let me read some of the key points first, and then we'll come back to the questions. So negative feedback undermines our motivation to learn, right? Negative feedback can undermine our motivation to learn. When we're monitoring our progress towards a goal, both positive and negative feedback tell us whether we're on track or if we're taking the best route to get there. We need feedback of both kinds. And she says, barriers to learning from feedback include tuning out, right? We tune out to feedback. We can't hear it for whatever reason, but we can't learn from something that we're not willing to listen to or that we choose to ignore. And she says, negative feedback undermines our learning because it lowers our self-esteem, especially if we're not confident. So we have to be careful about how we receive negative feedback, or frankly, how we give it as well, because can it erode our or other people's self-esteem? She says, when people interpret negative feedback as a sign of low commitment, so in other words, when I hear the feedback, I think, oh, I'm not really committed, I'm more likely to give up. But if I interpret the feedback as a lack of progress, So the feedback says that, oh, you're not making that much progress, but your commitment is still good. Great. I still remain encouraged. But if I hear the feedback in a way, because of my filter or because of the way it's delivered, as it's an indication of a lack of commitment, I'm more likely to give up. That's what the research shows. She also says, similar to the glass half empty and half forward, it's easier to tolerate negative feedback when we have experience or expertise. The feedback is not going to challenge our competence or our self-worth because we know we're expert. Makes sense, right? So again, this helps us as we think about what kind of feedback do I want to pursue from other people, and what feedback do I want to give towards other people? Is negative feedback or feedback given a certain way likely to discourage people, have them give up on their goals? Very important in terms of how we choose to support others along their path to achieving a goal. So before we get to the questions, just a few more points. Strategies to stay motivated and learn from mistakes. Ask about progress. So look for feedback. Secondly, take a learning mindset. So think about and that's suggested here in terms of question 2. I'll come back to the question in a moment. If we set a goal to learn rather than to do something perfectly, then we've made progress even if we've quote unquote failed. So is the goal to learn something, not to necessarily achieve a specific, deliberate, measurable result with respect to expertise? In other words, is it progress, not necessarily perfection? That's a very good way to stay motivated and learn from mistakes. She also talks about distancing. Create some space between you and your own failure. Imagine that it happened to a stranger, not that it happened to you. Don't take it so personally. That's another good way of staying motivated in the face of negative feedback. And also giving advice. Research has shown that adults struggling with saving money, controlling their temper, losing weight, or seeking employment were all more motivated to pursue their goals if they were asked to give advice to other people. So share what your experience has been, and doing so helps us stay motivated and not be discouraged by negative feedback. I thought that was a very interesting piece of research. Think about how if there's someone on your team who's struggling with something, we can invite them to give advice or to do a teaching piece on what they have learned so far. That helps improve motivation. She also talks about how negative information about failure is unique and specific. She says positive information is basically, yeah, we're on track. We're on track. You're doing great. It's very general. She said negative information is unique, specific, or should be, like, what is it that didn't get achieved and why? What is subpar? Where did something fall short? So that negative feedback can be really juicy and specific. Let's seek it out. And it also tends to be more elaborate rather than, yeah, you're doing great, perfect, stay on, beautiful. Great. Okay, so let's get to these questions that can help us learn from negative feedback. What makes us committed to our goal? Or what makes us expert in pursuing the goal? So feeling confident that the goal is within reach makes it more likely that we will learn from negative feedback. It's another one of her points. What makes us feel committed? So progress can help us feel committed, as we talked about in a previous chapter. And feeling confident that's within reach can make it more likely that we will learn from negative feedback. Can you think about pursuing goals in terms of growing abilities? As I said, when you succeed or fail to achieve a goal, you will always learn. So we can define the goal in terms of learning and progressing. Can we give others advice based upon our personal mishaps? As I've said, the research shows that could be very helpful. What can we learn from observing other successes and failures? So vicarious learning is a real thing, and learning from others' mishaps is often easier, can be easier. And then how might we pay close attention to information about failures, right? So that talks about some of the other things I spoke about earlier in terms of getting the benefits of negative feedback, the benefits of feedback about failures. Very, very useful. Part 3 in the book, after Keep Pulling, is about competing goals. That has 3 sections. So one chapter is about how to create an effective goal system. Chapter 10 is about how to recognize when temptation and lack of control will get in our way. Chapter 11 is about the importance of patience in managing multiple goals. And I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. So goal juggling. So we have to be careful when goals conflict with other goals. We can expect a rocky path when that happens. In motivational science language, there's a principle called maximizing attainment, which says that we choose actions that make as much positive impact on as many goals as possible, while minimizing the negative impact on our other goals. So maximizing attainment, we want to do things that check multiple boxes. And the word for that is multi-final, things that serve multiple goals simultaneously, as opposed to equifinal, meaning these are things that compete with each other. If we pursue multiple equifinal things, it makes the other redundant. So the example here, she says, the mental link between a means and a goal weakens the more there are other mental links for that means and for that goal. So for example, suppose that we think that biking is the best exercise for us. But if we recognize that there are other ways to exercise we would like just as much, which means biking is equifinal, or that there are other goals we can achieve by biking, and that's biking is multifinal, serving several goals simultaneously, then biking seems less instrumental for exercising. It's just not as attached, as closely attached to exercising. And that means that the dedication to biking may dwindle. It relates to the dilution principle that was talked about a little bit earlier. And in terms of goal juggling, she says, when we sense that we've made sufficient progress on a goal, we tend to compromise. We also tend to compromise when we seek variety. But we prioritize and stay on course and not compromise when we feel that our actions express our commitment to a goal. So the more I feel as though doing something expresses my commitment, it's an identity sense, in other words, and we'll come back to that later too, the more I'll feel committed to the goal. So as you consider your multiple goals, she suggests a few things. One, can you draw a goal system? List your broadest goals like career, relationships, health, and then below each goal, list the main sub-goals and the means that support it. Can you identify your multi-final means? These you want to pursue because they help you achieve multiple goals or sub-goals. Can you identify your equifinal means? These are means that you need to choose only one because they're substitutable. And if you keep a bunch of these around, they're going to dilute each other. Something important to identify. She says, can you identify goals that have only one means? She says, be sure to allocate resources to this particular means because there's no other way to achieve the goal. So really get underneath the hood of these goals to see which of the means will support them and recognize that if there's too many, there can be dilution happening. It's very interesting. And the last point, what trade-offs should we be making between our goals? For which conflicting goals should we seek a compromise? And for which goal conflict should we seek to prioritize one goal over the other? We're choosing one over the other, not compromising on both. Very interesting. So when making this decision, consider whether a goal is essential to our identity, or if we see that goal as pursuing a moral or ethical issue. If that's the case, we want to prioritize it. We want to prioritize goals that are close to our identity or ethical or moral issues. But if one way to see if that's not the case, if the added value for continuing to pursue the goal diminishes with each additional action, it's a way of saying it doesn't mean as much to me as it used to, then we want to seek a compromise instead of prioritizing that goal. So just some suggestions here for goal juggling. The next section with respect to competing goals relates to self-control. She says a self-control dilemma is the ultimate goal conflict. It involves choosing between what we believe we want to do and what we want to do instead. So our longer term goals we've identified and really what we want to do now that's testing our self-control. She said studies show that people who have self-control report that they're also happier and have more love in their lives. Self-control is a good thing, in other words. This is what she's saying. In order to effectively exercise self-control, we have to both detect the temptation and recognize it, and then battle that temptation. With respect to detecting a temptation, she talks about how it's easier to do that if we think about it in bulk. So for example, I'm not thinking about this temptation just as a single instance, but I'm thinking about thinking ahead, thinking about my future self. A decision I make today, I'm going to want to envision it making it every day, again and again over the years. So if I'm thinking, do I want to go off my diet for this thing, or do I want to cheat, quote unquote, on this goal for this? Is this possible temptation on the side something I could see myself doing over and over again? Think about it in bulk. That's a way of detecting a temptation and managing that temptation as well. Thinking ahead to my future self, she said, being reminded of your future self puts you in a broad decision frame. Makes us more psychologically connected to our future self. So we care more about the person we're going to become. That helps us think, potentially recognize self-control problems, and also making us care more about the long-term implications because we're more connected to that future self. Very important. She said self-control strategies can counteract temptations. This is that second piece, battling the temptation. And they can cancel out the influence of temptations. So importantly, she said, we should correctly judge the strength of the temptation we will face. So anticipate the temptation and be prepared for it. As long as our expectations are well calibrated, we'll be well prepared to fight off temptation. So some strategies that will change the situation itself, that will change that temptation. She talks about a pre-commitment strategy. So we can commit to eliminating that temptation before we're tempted. Temptations are easier to forego when they're unavailable, or, as I've often said to myself as well as others, it's easier to avoid a temptation than to resist it. So what's a pre-commitment strategy? And then she talks about strategies that change how we approach a situation. For example, how we talk to ourselves. If we imagine that this temptation is happening to someone else or happening to ourselves in the future, we use like third-person self-talk. That can help us create some distance, and that can help us see the temptation from a distance and not be as tempted. And she also talks about learning a lesson from tired healthcare workers. She says, exercise and self-control take a lot of effort. Don't make those decisions early. She says, don't make them late in the day when we're tired. So if you recognize you might be tempted to go off, to exercise self-control, not exercise but to exercise self-control, because it takes so much effort, face those temptations early in the day when we're not tired. Very important. And then she says, with practice, resolving self-control conflicts becomes easier. We can establish healthy habits that effectively control our behavior. And she refers actually to Wendy Wood's book called Good Habits, Bad Habits, which was featured in the Inspired Leadership Book Club last September. I encourage you to look at the recording for that. Once we've formed a habit, the context triggers our behavior directly. So we don't have to consciously address that temptation. We have a habit. So for example, we have a habit of buying certain things in the store. We have a habit of wearing certain clothes, or a habit of seeing certain people or not seeing certain people that can support us and boost our motivation. So look for ways to pick up on our habits. So questions to improve our self-control. First, what are our main temptations? What are some situations under which we're most likely to succumb to temptation? So know your enemy, in other words. How can you make it more, how can you better detect your self-control dilemmas? Maybe think about decisions in bulk, like we talked about. Think about yourself in the future. She says, you are your future self's best friend. What can you do for that person today? How do you battle temptations? Consider a pre-commitment that helps you achieve your goal, and also rewarding yourself for making progress. These are just quick suggestions for battling temptation. And when you are planning to resist temptation, How do you protect yourself from challenges like limited resources and feeling depleted? So this is that notion of make resisting temptation early in the day, or form a habit. This would be another way to do it. Okay, the next section in terms of competing goals is patience. And this is a section here about patience, what it is, how do we develop it, etc. She says the English word patient refers to both the person who's able to wait or someone who's in need of medical treatment. She said the root of both words is the one who suffers. The point is waiting is painful. She said waiting is hard because we're wired to discount our futures. Situations that require us to wait go against our human nature. Impatience is caused by lack of willpower, lack of trust, lack of caring, sometimes even a desire to get something off of our mind, right? I don't care. I'm impatient with it. It doesn't matter that much to me. I want to get it over with. That fourth category of a desire to get something off of our mind. Strategies to increase patience include distraction. So, just being busy with something else removes the impatience because we're just not aware of it quite as much. She talks about this gentleman named John Edmund Carrick, who developed something called the law of large numbers by flipping a coin 10,000 times. And the law of law of large numbers, says that if you flip a coin 10,000 times, on average, you're going to get 5,000 heads and 5,000 tails. It's pretty straightforward. She points out that he did this when he was held in captivity in World War II in a Nazi camp. And he distracted himself by flipping a coin, and he wound up with this useful research. Fascinating little story. Another way to increase patience is to make decisions in advance. Distance increases patience. Make decisions in advance. Pressure does not serve us. Wait to choose. Postpone the decision while we can, and think about the decision for a while if we can. Address the cause of the impatience, of course, which means addressing the lack of willpower, lack of care, lack of trust, meaning lack of trust that something's actually going to happen. Like if I exercise willpower by, or if I exercise patience by waiting for something and it doesn't come, do I trust that it's going to come? And as she says, it may be just a really good practice to change your mind and not be patient. That could be a learning or an awareness that something has changed. Either in the outer reality or in our perception of what's real, realistic, and what's not. And she says you could also be patient for the sake of others. Ask others to join us in the wait, and that's another strategy as well. Okay, here are some questions that help us to become more patient. Ask ourselves, are we more patient in some contexts than others? What could we learn from that experience? Are we making short-sighted financial, medical, academic, or other decisions? Where is that patience issue coming up? When we are impatient, are we mainly concerned about making the decision itself? Or are we feeling agitated or angry about having to wait? Is it about the exercise of patience, or is it about a specific short-sighted decision? Look at our own experience, learn from it, is what she's talking about. Why, right, exactly. How can we become more patient? And she talks again about distracting ourselves, making advanced decisions, waiting to choose, etc. She also talks about reminding ourselves what we like about what we're waiting for. Just remind ourselves, why are we waiting in the first place? What's the payoff? And maybe we can use technology to get things off of our mind and ease the experience of waiting. Or we can be patient for the sake of others, meaning we can engage others in the wait. That's another way of demonstrating more patience and practicing more patience. So that's the section about competing goals. The last section of the book is called social support. That includes pursuing goals in the presence of others, pursuing goals with others, and what she calls goals make a happy relationship. So chapter 12 is about pursuing our goals in the presence of others. Chapter 13 is about goals with others, goals that require a joint effort, in other words. And chapter 14 explores the implications of social support for successful relationships. So in terms of pursuing goals in the presence of others, She says, when other people pursue their goals in parallel to you, you might conform by working harder. Other people's increase your motivation. They might even serve as role models, but we also might relax our efforts in response to others' actions. She talks a little bit more about why is it one versus the other sometimes in that chapter, but pointing out that it could be either one. She said the general rule is that we learn to seek actions that complement rather than overlap with or repeat what others do. It's important to have both role models as well as anti-role models. So people who model what we don't want to do, that's important. So the presence of others that spur us on and the presence of others that make us think, I don't want to do that, or I don't want to do what she's doing or what he's doing. That's important as well. She talks about social facilitation. Very, very interesting point. A tendency to work harder when other people are watching. And she said it's even true for animals. The presence of animals respond favorably to the presence of an audience of the same species. The presence of observers increases a performer's psychological and physiological arousal. We assume that the audience is evaluating us or competing with us or encouraging us, and that makes us apprehensive and excited. Except something to note, that same type of arousal can hinder our performance on more complex and unpracticed tasks. So again, as before, if we don't necessarily know what we're doing, the presence of others can sometimes, we can feel that pressure and it can impact our performance and our motivation. But this notion of being in the presence of others, she says, even having stand-ins for the presence of others, like a photograph of a loved one on our desk, can trigger the social facilitation effect. It's interesting. So all those years about having a photograph of loved ones on your desk, why is that? It makes us feel better. It supports us in pursuing our goals. These cues can make us feel like we're being watched even when we're not, but watched in a good way, of course, supported, acknowledged. She said, we also feel like our actions leave a greater mark when we're being watched. It's like another pair of eyes on what we're doing increases the magnitude of what we're doing. Very interesting, I think. So the questions at the end of the chapter focused on helping us design a social environment that motivates us to stick with our goals. Think about the people in your life. Should you conform to their values, including their stated goals and actions? Should we complement what they say and do? Do we want to do what they do, or do we want to do something a little bit different? Pay attention to that. There could be good reasons to do both. She said it's useful to identify how your goals and actions fit with others' goals and actions. Pay attention to that. Next question she asked is, who should be your role models and your anti-role models? And she said, role models don't just demonstrate success. So I want to be successful like that person. She said, a role model is somebody who expects you to do well. And the last question here is, how can we use the power of being watched to facilitate our performance? I think this is, again, a very, very interesting section here. When we're executing highly practiced goal tasks, use social facilitation to our advantage, but when learning a new task, try practicing alone. Don't put ourselves in the presence of others. That might create pressure for ourselves. But if we do well, that picture of others or even a stand-in or the presence of others can help us along, can help us pursue our goals, give us a bit of a tailwind. I think it's very, very interesting. The next section has to do with what she calls pursuing goals with others. So sometimes there can be social loafing, which means we're backing off on our efforts when we know that there's somebody else there to pick the slack. So for example, when there's many people splitting a check at dinner, individual people sometimes relax their spending limits. I can spend a little more because it's going to be spread out over multiple people. That's what she calls social loafing. She says that if the reason we loaf is that no one, not even us, can see the impact of our actions, the solution may be make individual contributions more visible. So when contributions become less visible, they can be discounted and that could lead to loafing. Make contributions more visible. So for example, when it's clear who did what in a group project at work, people feel more accountable and their contribution meaningfully influences the success of the project, so they work harder. So there's a suggestion there for those of us that work on teams or lead teams, make individual contributions more valuable. They're less likely to get lost and they're more likely to motivate people, both the person who's doing the action and motivate other people to keep up their efforts as well. In terms of role models, as identified in the previous chapter, she said when people see themselves as role models in a group setting, they're motivated to do more to take full advantage of their influence. There's another lever there that could be used to encourage people to be role models and recognize that it boosts motivation. So chapter end questions having to do with pursuing goals with others. The questions at the end of the chapter include, what are the main goals that you are pursuing with others? And what are they? Be aware of them. How do we minimize social loafing and free riding in pursuit of these goals? So consider making contributions identifiable, allowing team members to inspire each other or facilitating the inspiration of team members one to another, moving to smaller groups or individual tasks, and allowing team members to contribute in ways that feel personal. These are all ways to minimize social loafing or free riding, as this is called. And then the third question really has some subparts. How well does our team coordinate? Is the division of labor optimal? Do we minimize overlapping tasks and knowledge while not undermining our independence, just in case the group makeup changes? Does feeling close to someone sometimes lead us to act selfishly despite having good intentions? So for example, would we ask someone on our team to make compromises we wouldn't ask someone else to make? Sometimes we ask the people closest to us to make compromises, and that could hinder us. And finally, can you motivate yourself by focusing on the work others didn't do when you're highly committed, and focusing on the work that others did do, the glass half full, when the commitment is lower? So again, this is something, I'm going to reread this again here. Suggestion is that we can motivate ourselves more by focusing on the work others didn't do when we're highly committed. When we're highly committed, if we see people didn't do something, we want to jump in and fill the gap. When our commitment is lower, then we want to focus on what others did do, because that motivates us to keep up. So these are all good suggestions here for pursuing goals with others. And finally, the last section she calls goals make a happy relationship. And this really brings the book together to a large degree, very importantly, I think. And it brings it back to relationships. Supporting each other's goals is important in any successful relationship. And a relationship, she says, is only successful when both people feel that they're getting something and giving something. Often it's easier to provide support if you are sharing similar goals, as she talks about work, relationships, friendships. She talks about how our friends, we can grow apart from our friends as we get older if we pursue different goals. That makes sense. Ultimately, what matters is that a relationship helps rather than hurts our goals. Importantly, she said, when we provide appreciation to another person really matters. So knowing when the appreciation peaks, when is the peak impact of that appreciation, will help us from feeling disappointed by the amount of gratitude we receive. So we may want to ask for appreciation, gratitude, acknowledgement at a certain time. It matters more sometimes versus others. That's very interesting. Or how do we find out when it's most important to express appreciation or support for somebody else? Really important. She said, when you pursue a goal alongside friends, colleagues, family members, you'll experience a deep sense of connection to that person or to that group. Goals that require a joint effort glue the group that pursues them together. No matter the goal, the fact that you need each other to succeed brings you closer together. This is something that I was very familiar with years ago when I was doing a lot of community service projects with teams and with leadership teams. Let's pursue the goal together. It breaks down hierarchy. There's a whole bunch of benefits to activities like this. But a shared goal is a glue between people pursuing it together. So that's one of the reasons it's so important why teams need clear, aligned goals. We're doing this together. She also talks about the importance of feeling known, and that a true connection is with someone who can support your goals. And in order for them to do that at the most basic level, they must know you and make you feel known, to be seen and valued in that relationship. Very important. She said, the extent to which another person supports your motivation predicts how satisfied you are in that relationship. Your relationships are not likely to ask if you feel that somebody does not support your motivation. They don't have your back with respect to what's important to you. That makes sense. So she says, develop insights into the roles of those people around you, right? To understand what their goals are. The roles and goals, the roles of those around you in your goal system, and understand their goal systems. How could I play a role in their goal system? It works both ways, understanding their goal system and understanding my goal system and communicating that. So what could we do to help align these goals and make these goals clear? She says, ask yourself, how well do you know the people in your life? Do you know their goals, their needs, their aspirations? Can you draw their goal system? Or can you ask them to share their goal system with you in some way that is clear for you? If you're struggling, start asking questions, making observations, taking mental notes, because it's important. Do the people in your life know your goal system? Is it possible that you've been too quiet or ambiguous about what you want? What do you do to facilitate your partner's goals? And what do they do that helps you to achieve your goals? Pay attention to that and what needs to be changed. It's also a great formula for boosting partnership overall. And can you develop goals like a new hobby that will serve as glue for a relationship? So if the relationship is sliding in some way, let's approach it the other way. If a relationship is sliding, how can we introduce a shared goal? Give people something to work on together, for example, that is meaningful for them and that will serve as glue for a relationship. So it's a goal that can allow me to be supported and to support someone else in turn, very importantly. So just by way of a quick review here. The four essential ingredients we need for successful behavioral change, just as a summary. First, we need to choose a goal. Second, sustain our motivation as we move from here to there. Third, we have to learn to juggle multiple goals. And fourth, we need to leverage social support. Those are the four pieces. Great quotation here. Honestly, this is not from the book. This is just a quotation that I like that I think fits perfectly here. Do not wait. The time will never be just right. Start where you stand and work with whatever tools you may have at your command, and better tools will be found as you go along. Better tools will be found as you go along. So from my point of view, this book offers a number of really useful tools. I encourage you to take a look at it, review this video if you'd like. I'm happy to discuss or share some questions or insights that I might have. I consider myself as an executive coach and leadership consultant, a student of these things, but always learning more. I encourage you to do the same and stay motivated. We'll see you soon.